Hello everyone, today is the day where I have decided to take the clown decade a little bit more seriously. Because today, as you can probably tell, I am going to be covering COP26, the big old climate summit, where world leaders and other people who are of importance to climate action come together to tell everyone else what they are going to do. And one thing I've seen that is quite common with this is that no one's actually commenting on what's being said by anyone. People are mainly going for a hypocrisy angle. So, for example, you've got what I can only describe as ridiculously large motorcade that is just for Joe Biden to travel across Scotland. And I do mean ridiculously large. We are looking at probably about 40 cars and trucks driving down an English motorway, or Scottish motorway I should say, to get to COP26, just for Joe Biden and his helpers. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's wrong to pick out hypocrisy like this. What I am saying is that, one, it's not very effective, and two, it's definitely not going to be very effective for me if I just point out the same thing. Though, just to cover all bases on this, there have also been over 400 private jets emitting a total of 13,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide, and that was to transport world leaders and business executives to the UN's COP26 in Glasgow. Now, if people are wondering what exactly the alternative would be to have a conference completely virtual and online. So yes, hypocrisy, bad, blah blah blah. These people don't care. I mention it every year, it's just boring to go through again. So instead, I have decided to get the 4 British speakers we have had at COP26 so far, or 4 major British speakers I should say, and go through exactly what is being said, because I think there is a habit in the right wing now for anytime climate change to be brought up, we just say they're hypocrites and they're crazy socialists and leave it at that. I'd rather take a bit more of a nuanced take on it, to be honest. Because climate change is actually a serious issue, it's just not apocalyptic like most climate cultists say. It is something we actually do have to deal with and will have to deal with in future, but it is worth seeing just how much our leaders are either overselling it or potentially underselling it. They're probably not going to be underselling it though. So, first things first, we had Boris Johnson, who was the first speaker at the event naturally, and so had the honour of introducing the entire conference. So let's take a look at some of the highlights.
Welcome to Glasgow, and to Scotland, whose most globally famous fictional son is almost certainly a man called James Bond.
So just to take a break from him talking at this point, you may notice that I am cutting between pretty much every line he has. This is because he's leaving massive gaps between them, and I don't know why. I feel like a Sandpiper's editor here. Anyway, I'm going to be doing that a lot throughout his speech, so just prepare yourself for it.
Who generally comes to the climax of his highly lucrative film strapped to a doomsday device, desperately trying to work out which coloured wire to pull to turn it off, while a red digital clock ticks down remorselessly to a detonation that will end human life as we know it. And
so the only reference that I can think of with a red digital clock and wires and all that comes from Goldfinger, and that was to blow up Fort Knox to get to the gold. But obviously he has to oversell it, and this is overselling exactly what climate change will do. It's making it out to be, as he called it, a doomsday device that will end human life as we know it. I mention this on the channel every time, but there is no IPCC model that ends human life as we know it. There's not even one that ends with 1 billion deaths directly due to climate change. So already it's being oversold, and if it's being oversold, we are probably going to be oversold a solution, but I'll let him make his points.
We are in roughly the same position, my fellow global leaders, as James Bond.
Credit where it's due with Boris Johnson, he knows how to sell a story. He is unironically making climate action sound cool here. And this is the thing with politics, if you can make your opinions and your routes to power sound cool, you are probably going to do pretty well. I mean, he won an election after all.
And the doomsday device is real. And the clock is ticking to the furious rhythm of hundreds of billions of pistons and turbines and furnaces and engines with which we are pumping carbon into the air faster and faster, record outputs, and quilting the Earth in an invisible and suffocating blanket of CO2.
So yes, again, the analogy is probably very good for trying to get people on side. well, most people will be already on side, so it doesn't matter, but at least it's making him sound cool. And he is also correct, CO2 numbers are still going up. But this is the thing I always talk about when it comes to climate. The climate and what affects it is so much more than just the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Though that is probably one of the main man-made ways that climate change has been affected, especially in recent years. And then all positive steps made to either reduce the carbon dioxide in the air, such as reforestation efforts. I mean, NASA published a study 3 years ago showing that global forest loss over the past 35 years has now been more than offset by new forest growth. That means that there are more trees now than there were 35 years ago. And that trend appears to be continuing. But hopefully Boris Johnson will go on then more about this single factor.
Raising the temperature of the planet with a speed and an abruptness that is entirely man-made. And we know what the scientists tell us, and we have learned not to ignore them.
So he's about to go into a bunch of doomsday scenarios, and I'm just going to quickly rattle them off because he goes on about them for a bit. So long story short, you get 2 degrees higher, you'll get quite a few more crop failures throughout some parts of the Earth, especially those around the equator. You go up, to a 4-degree increase, you end up with a load of places on the planet under sea level. But luckily some people have actually read the IPCC report, which I consider kind of the Bible of what's actually going to happen with climate change. And if you watched Jordan Peterson's podcast the other day with Michael Schellenberger, you will know that the IPCC has never, ever had a doomsday scenario in its modelling or predictions. And The Spectator even covered it as well when it came out, with one of the paragraphs saying, "As ever with the IPCC reports, the content doesn't live up to the historical reviews. If the vision presented in it were the basis of a disaster movie, you would want your money back." And I think the most telling part, as was mentioned by Boris Johnson, that we would have more deadly and more frequent weather events. I think this is summed up in this section on tropical monsoons. So you have a direct quote from the IPCC there, read it yourself if you want. But Ross Clark sums it up by saying, "Tropical monsoons have been getting wetter over the past 40 years, but the trend isn't clear because of high variability. That hardly justifies apocalyptic visions of great storms. Indeed, the report notes a general weakening of wind speeds over land, with the exception of Australia. That is what might be expected if this data suggests the Arctic is warming faster than the tropics, reducing the differential in temperature between the two." So again, this isn't saying that there's no problem whatsoever with climate change. What it is saying is that it might cause a few more problems and possibly a few more deadly storms. But even the direct quote from the IPCC says that we have low confidence that this is going to be 100% true, which seems to reflect my vision of what we should do about climate change, which is slowly move away from fossil fuels, move away from coal definitely and wood burning on a mass scale, as some lesser economically developed countries do, move towards gas, and slowly work our way towards nuclear energy being the main form of producing electricity on a national scale. And if you want smaller scale communities, you are more than welcome to use renewable resources if you wish. Hydroelectricity is actually one of the most reliable ways you can do it, and Norway have done a very good job with it. But that requires being very lucky with your geography. Anyway, let's see if Boris Johnson says anything else of importance.
If we don't get serious about climate change today, it will be too late for our children to do so tomorrow.
So again, it's a kind of moralising language. It's you are doing this for future generations, which everyone can agree that doing things that positively affect future generations is a good thing. And along with the narrative that this is an apocalyptic, humanity-destroying scenario, saying that you are going to be saving billions of lives and billions of your children's lives is going to make anyone come on side. I'm just going to skip to the part where he actually goes into policy and what can be done about climate change, because as usual with Boris Johnson, a lot of this speech is just blustering. It's very friendly blustering, and I do quite enjoy it, but I'm trying to save time with this video.
We can phase out the use of cars with hydrocarbon internal combustion engines. By 2035, we can do that. We in the UK are leading by ending new sales by 2030.
So this is the start of where he starts bringing up the years where we need to have dead ends to hydrocarbons, essentially. And he does bring it up a lot. I think he brings it up with coal fire stations in his next point too. And I'm not against trying to move away from the use of hydrocarbons. We do have a lot left under the ground, and I think it would be better off to reserve those while we find more sustainable and cost-effective ways to produce our electricity. As I say, nuclear is my end goal at the moment. But my issue with trying to force the shutdown of coal fire stations and petrol cars and things like that is that that ultimately just affects the poor, because this new technology is usually very expensive at first. And as far as I can tell, there's no reason to believe that the electric car industry will be cheap enough for the poorest in society to actually afford them. Then again, it's just the sale of new petrol cars that's being brought into Britain in 2030, so they can probably still buy second-hand petrol cars. And an added bonus is that if a lot of people are buying electric cars, that means demand for petrol goes down, making it cheaper. So it might be actually a great 4D chess move by Boris Johnson, but in my opinion it isn't. It's just blustering to get that green agenda rolling, because that's the in thing to do at the moment.
We can plant hundreds of millions of trees, 1 trillion, and halt and reverse deforestation by 2030.
Again, that year of 2030 again. He wants to plant 1 billion trees by 2030. Alright, fair enough. I am completely fine with reforestation efforts and conservation efforts. They are fine. I don't think that's mental in any way. But the thing is that deforestation generally, on a worldwide scale, has been reversed. And that is especially true in Britain. So in my opinion, it's a bit of a weird thing to bring up, but I suppose in some countries, deforestation is still increasing. Such as countries that have the Amazon basin in, and countries where many people are still using wood to warm themselves. There's quite a lot of places in India still like that. And oddly enough, coal is the best way to get away from that. So again, it's the same with everything. You have to slowly transition to where we are in the first world for the third world. You can't just stop them all using coal fire stations by 2040, as Boris Johnson said in this speech.
But because that is the way to restore the balance of nature and to fix carbon in the air.
So this again is a weird thing for a geologist, as I bring up every time. Restore the power of nature and fix carbon. So we are at one of the lowest points in history for the amount of carbon in the air. And this is a graph brought up quite a lot of the time by what people would call climate deniers. And people who use this graph alone to say carbon dioxide does not affect temperature, that's not what this graph is showing. And that's not the point I'm trying to make either. The point I'm trying to make is that carbon dioxide being at an all-time low is a very rare thing to happen in natural history. And naturally we are at a carbon low, since we started to lose carbon dioxide about, as you can tell from the graph, 25 million years ago. And there is no doubt that millions or trillions of tons of carbon dioxide are being pumped into the atmosphere by human action. But there seems to be this whole idea with the green cult, in that nature is always perfect, nature always knows what it wants to do. When the reality is that nature has actually tried its hardest to kill everything on the planet quite a few times. I mean, we've had 5 mass extinctions already, and we're probably going through a 6th, and that is probably due to human action. To an extent, because not only have we affected temperature to a degree, but we have also hunted quite a lot of things to death, including woolly mammoths, and also we've introduced species to where they shouldn't be, and that's what got the dodo killed. But humans also have this habit of wanting to conserve their environment. And I suppose that's what they are trying to do at COP26. The problem is that if you start literally killing people in your effort to save the environment, you are actually just not really helping that much. As Roger Hallam said on the podcast 2 weeks ago, where he would allow people in an ambulance to die if he blocked their path in the attempt to have everyone change their way of life to save, quote-unquote, 1 billion people by saving the climate. And my issue is that that seems to be how Boris Johnson is thinking here. And I do find that relatively dangerous, because if you're trying to say the ends justify the means here, and your ends are a falsification as they are, basically saying we're stopping an apocalypse, and your means, especially if implemented poorly, could negatively affect some of the poorest people in society, then yes, I don't think that's a very good idea. But generally, I think the free market is going in the direction that everyone at COP26 wants anyway. Many people are thinking of getting electric cars and things like that, and many people are trying to be more green conscious in that they are trying to install solar panels on their own houses. A lot of people have their houses well insulated already. All things like this because it can save them money as well. The free market seems to be answering all these issues, basically, but this is the issue I have with COP26. It's saying that's not good enough. We can't trust everyone to do that, and the thing is you don't need everyone to do that. But I guess we'll see what else he has to say.
And as we look at the green industrial revolution that's now needed around the world.
See, things like that. He says we need a green industrial revolution. Well, as far as I can see, we are already going through it. The industrial revolution of the Victorian time, that took decades to actually go through properly. The problem as I see it with green technology and things like that is that it's really hit and miss, and it's really, really geography dependent how good it actually is. So Denmark's quite a windy place. That's actually quite good for wind power, and it's also so sparsely populated that it's actually quite effective at powering up the rural areas, whereas in Copenhagen they can't rely on it. And as mentioned before, in Norway, like 90% of their power comes from hydroelectricity because they've got these big old mountains that they basically dug into and got really effective turbines that are water powered to power a lot of the, again, rural areas. You move to more urban areas, it's just impossible. And this is actually a massive issue with Britain because we are effectively a very urbanised country. So trying to do what the Greens and Extinction Rebellion want, which is basically just have a wind turbine on every house, it's really short-sighted and not going to work, but this is unfortunately what happens when you only listen to dogma. But this dogma from Boris Johnson seems to get worse and worse and worse. So he mentions that Glasgow is the place where James Watt developed the steam engine, which was coal-powered, and then he says this.
Yes, my friends, we've brought you to the very place where the doomsday machine began to tick. And even though for 200 years the industrialized countries were in complete ignorance of the problem that they were creating, we now have a duty to find those funds.
So I have a massive issue with calling the steam engine a doomsday device. The steam engine saved more lives than it, so far, has cost. And as he says, they were in ignorance that they were going to create a climate catastrophe. We've known that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas since the late 1800s. I think it was discovered just after a century after the first steam engine was actually created in 1775, I believe. But he's framed it in such a way that only the CO2 emissions mattered from that, and not the fact that the steam engine industrialised the entire Western world, and was probably one of the best life-saving devices ever created. Since it drove the cost for travel down, it drove the cost of producing an awful lot of commodities down, and freed up a lot of time for people so they weren't killing themselves working, while at the same time reducing the price of pretty much everything that they needed. So just to paint it as this only bad thing really does annoy me. That's the last thing I'm probably going to cover in Boris Johnson's speech, because the rest of it's basically just winding on the same old story of we want to hit all our targets we've been talking about over the past few COPs by 2030, and then send a load of money over to the lesser economically developed countries to get their industrial revolution to skip all the steps that have caused climate change. Which isn't the worst idea in the world, to be honest, if you do think it's an apocalyptic scenario. And honestly, getting everyone to cleaner and more sustainable types of energy is just a good idea anyway. The problem comes in with climate cultists when you are forced into having to pay more for these things, and having your quality of life go down because of it when you didn't want it. And as mentioned with the petrol cars, that is a perfectly reasonable, I think, worry to have about something like this. But really the speech felt like a lot of emotional dogma, and was just bringing back the target dates for quite a lot of things they were doing anyway. Honestly, it's not the most unreasonable thing in the world. The main gripes I had with it is, as I said, probably going to affect quite a few people negatively, and it's not necessarily the people that you want to affect negatively any more so than they already will be. And also there was quite a bit of an emotional manipulation to try and get a lot of people on side to what Boris Johnson and the rest of COP26 will want for the climate crisis. We're doing it for the children, we're doing it for the poor people, we're doing it to stop, as he put it, a James Bond villain type bomb that will destroy humanity. And I know he's framing it like that to, one, make it sound funny and cool, which, to be honest, it does, but also because it's just the narrative going around at the moment that we are going into an apocalypse. Science doesn't back it up, though. So that was Boris Johnson's speech. We should now move on to the next Brit, which is Prince Charles.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us just how devastating a global cross-border threat can be. Climate change and biodiversity loss are no different. In fact, they pose an even greater existential threat, to the extent that we have to put ourselves on what might be called a warlike footing. Okay,
so I would say that this is already slightly better than what Boris Johnson is saying. Now, with biodiversity, I don't really have that much of an issue with. As far as I'm aware, biodiversity goes up and down throughout time anyway. And when there's less biodiversity, you are more likely to have an explosion of biodiversity with a bunch of mutations coming in certain species to make new ones. And I believe we are already seeing that in newly discovered birds in recent decades. However, losing certain species such as bees will have a big effect on things such as farming. And losing predators of, say, the locusts will mean more locusts in the third world, which won't be good for their crops. So again, these things aren't things that you shouldn't worry about at all. But they're not apocalyptic either, and Prince Charles has made it clear that he doesn't think it's apocalyptic either. He says it's probably a greater threat than the COVID-19 pandemic has shown what cross-border internationalist issues can bring. So already he is miles better, as far as I'm concerned, than any climate cultist.
Having myself had the opportunity of consulting many of you over these past 18 months, I know you all carry a heavy burden on your shoulders, and you do not need me to tell you that the eyes and hopes of the world are upon you, to act with all dispatch and decisively, because time has quite literally run out.
So again, it's not an apocalyptic scenario that he's trying to put forward, and it does seem to be in the scientific consensus that we don't have a lot of time before some of the positive feedback loops start coming into effect, and getting above, 1.5 degrees Celsius will soon become 2 instead. That does seem a likely scenario, and I've never denied that on this channel. However, the effects of it are obviously not apocalyptic, and any issues that are brought about by it we are already preparing for. There is no reason not to try and minimise it further. There is no reason not to individually act and, say, start buying electric cars if you can afford it. Or start helping out with more conservation projects and things like that. And this is what people are naturally doing anyway. The issue is, as I keep mentioning, that it is not worth sacrificing lives in the present to make the future slightly easier. But I don't know what Prince Charles's policies are at the moment, but luckily he's about to go into it.
We also know that countries, many of whom are burdened by growing levels of debt, simply cannot afford to go green. Here we need a vast military-style campaign to marshal the strength of the global private sector. With trillions at its disposal, far beyond global GDP, and with the greatest respect, beyond even the governments of the world's leaders, it offers the only real prospect of achieving fundamental economic transition.
So the answer that Prince Charles has put forward is one that I don't actually disagree with. Strengthen the private sector and make innovations and green technology and things like that cheaper. And he doesn't necessarily just mean wind turbines and things like that, because I hate wind turbines. But it probably includes nuclear and things like that, because they don't produce carbon dioxide, which is the thing everyone cares about. Exactly what he means by military style, I don't really know. But his answer is essentially what my answer has been the whole time. Improve free trade, improve innovation, and give more power to the private sector. Because public sector answers to these questions seem to be horrible. So I've seen people like Lawrence Fox and things like that saying, oh, destroy the monarchy after Queen Elizabeth because these people all have the green bug. I'm sorry, but there's a difference between being a climate cultist apocalyptic scenario moron and being Prince Charles, who says, yeah, it's going to cause quite a few issues. Get the private sector to sort it. This has been my answer since day one. My literal first 2 videos were about fracking and how the private sector is probably the best way forward with it, and how it will help reduce climate change and carbon emissions. If you actually listen to what Prince Charles says, there's not really that much to criticise.
Many of your countries, I know, are already feeling the devastating impact of climate change through ever-increasing droughts, mudslides, floods, hurricanes, cyclones and wildfires, as we've just seen on that terrifying film.
So again with this, it is true, basically. There is an increase in the amount of extreme weather events we are getting. I mean, it depends on which one you're talking about. Droughts seem to be happening less so than, say, cyclones and hurricanes. And there also seems to be a slight trend in the increased intensity of them, though that ranges from low to medium confidence only on the IPCC report. However, if you look at the actual number of deaths from natural disasters and things like that, the trend is that basically we barely get any these days. And with good reason. We have excellent warning systems for, say, when a tsunami or a storm is coming in. We have excellent sea defences for things like that. Droughts, I mean, we have excellent charities and international efforts to get water to places affected by droughts. So you can make all the propaganda films you want, and individuals will still be affected by these. But ultimately we seem to be pretty effective at solving this issue. But again, that's not a reason to not start trying to move away from fossil fuels to something a bit more sustainable. But I'm with Prince Charles. Let the private sector try and sort it. At least with them it will be through individuals' choices.
Any leader who has had to confront such life-threatening challenges knows that the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of prevention. So I can only urge you, as the world's decision makers, to find practical ways of overcoming differences so we can all get down to work together to rescue this precious planet and save the threatened future of our young people. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Again, it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just stop wars, stop pointless violence, overcome your differences and cooperate. Literally, what is wrong with that? People were saying, oh, he should never be king after this. There's nothing wrong with that speech, especially compared to the others we've had. Anyway, we're going to move on to David Attenborough now, the expert-in-chief on climate alarmism. Take it away, Sir David.
As you spend the next 2 weeks debating, negotiating, persuading, and compromising, as you surely must, it's easy to forget that ultimately the emergency climate comes down to a single number: the concentration of carbon in our atmosphere.
See, already I don't like this. The concentration of CO2, as shown in the graph before, isn't the only way we determine whether there's been a warm period or cold period, an ice age or a warm age. And I do want to make it clear, you go back, say, I don't know, 5 million years, maybe a bit more, you can see we already had way higher CO2 levels, and the temperature was dropping still, because it's a multi-factor thing. And don't get me wrong, you put up CO2 instantly over the course of a century or so, that is going to affect temperatures and make them go up, as we can see. And, you know, humans are causing some mass extinctions and things like that. But you look at this graph, basically every line between geological periods, we define different geological periods by massive changes in rocks, and this is generally done by massive changes in the systems of the planet. For instance, in Britain there's limestone everywhere in the Carboniferous period because we had coral reefs all over Britain. We were in a tropical state. But then after that, Britain was uplifted, and we have Permian sandstones because we then turn into a desert. And CO2 levels seem to coincide with these changes in geological time, and I think that's actually the main reason. From 10 million years ago, we've had a massive drop in CO2. We're going out of the tertiary period into the quaternary period. But humans have thrown a spanner in the works. Temperatures are now going up along with CO2. Probably not to levels we saw before the drop in the tertiary, but still they are rising. So it just seems stupid for me for David Attenborough to say only one thing matters, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. He's dropped it at the first hurdle as far as I'm concerned.
The measure that greatly determines global temperature. And the changes in that one number is the clearest way to chart our own story, for it defines our relationship with our world.
So in context of humans, that is probably got some truth to it, but I want to see where he goes with this.
For much of humanity's ancient history, that number bounced wildly between 180 and 300. And so too did global temperatures.
So as far as I can tell, this graph is correct. The temperatures seem about right. CO2, as far as I can tell, seems about right. As far as I can tell, the science is all correct. But we have had, again, other, probably worse issues for the climate and the atmosphere and things like this. So a big example was CFCs, which were chemical propellants used in aerosol cans, and they were creating big old ozone holes in the 70s, and scientists discovered this before it became catastrophic. And so, partly due to regulators and things like this, aerosol sprays stopped using CFCs as propellants, but were still as effective and not breaking through the ozone. So again, we are pretty good at finding issues with the environment and solving them. And I don't see why the climate's going to be any different. I don't see the need to be apocalyptic about this. Do what Prince Charles did. Let the private sector sort it. They're pretty good at it, and a lot of them are moving over to renewable energy sources and trying to innovate and make them cheaper. So Attenborough's speech carries on by saying about 10,000 years ago the climate and the CO2 levels were stable. And from there, humans could take advantage of this, start farming, start having reliable weather, and reliable cycles in agriculture and things like that. Which brings him on to say this.
The global temperature has not wavered over this period by more than plus or minus 1 degree Celsius. Until now.
Yes, again, that is true. Over the past few millennia, the global temperatures do fluctuate within a 2 degree margin. And it appears we are, yes, going above the threshold for the upper end of that. Now, depending exactly what your source is, how far above that threshold we are in the current year is pretty much debatable. We just know we are above it. And exactly what that means for the planet we can only model and predict, with at most medium confidence from the IPCC.
Burning of fossil fuels, our destruction of nature, our approach to industry, construction and learning, are releasing carbon into the atmosphere at an unprecedented pace and scale.
Again, this is why this speech annoys me. This is just apocalyptic thinking again. Oh, look at all this bad stuff that, as check notes, made people's lives much better. It's like, yeah, I get it. Pumping a load of carbon into the atmosphere is not ideal. We're trying to find ways around it. You are specifically trying to find ways around it. You don't need to go apocalyptic about it, because it's so easy to poke holes in, and then you get people saying, well, if you're going to lie about that, why wouldn't you lie about the whole thing? Not to mention the fact that it's mostly the Western world who are reducing their carbon emissions. And to be honest, his speech goes on for another 3-4 minutes or so. It's all just repeating the same thing, basically. It's this big grand narrative of, I think at one point he says no country is sustainable because those that are developed basically have too big a carbon footprint. And obviously the rest of the world isn't developed. But the place they put the sustainability, or sustainable I should say, threshold on the x-axis is just ridiculous to me. It's like they went, right, here are all the highly developed nations, right, how do we guilt them all in? Oh, we just put the, about a ton of CO2 per capita, that'll do it. That's how we decided that it was sustainable. It just plays into the narrative that the right wing have that nothing will ever be enough. And honestly, when you see graphs like that, I am totally on board with them when they say that. Because pretty much all of these developed nations, apart from maybe India and China, they are all moving towards that sustainable axis with about a ton of CO2 per capita, while others are moving up. So I just find it funny that it's over to Glasgow or Paris or something like that they all come to guilt us into it, while China and Russia don't even turn up sometimes. So the last speech I was going to go through was the Queen's, but having just gone through it myself, there isn't really much to comment on. She basically says how proud she is of our family for taking the issues of the environment seriously, given Charles and William do quite a lot of conservation work, and then mentions that what leaders of today do for the people of their country who are not even born yet is statesmanship, and that's when these leaders can put differences with other nations aside for a common cause, in this case the cause of climate change, then you can achieve great things. And so basically it is a massive speech of wishing the best for everyone, and being impressed with how quickly it seems everyone is taking the situation seriously. Which to an extent I can agree with. It's not a particularly political speech in any regard. It is essentially a very eloquent way of the Queen saying good luck and go forth. But as I say, there wasn't really anything specific to comment on it, so if you want to go see it, the link is in the description. But I think to conclude, what I will say is that Boris Johnson is obviously on the more apocalyptic side when it comes to the climate crisis narrative. David Attenborough seems to want to back his up by science, but it all just seems like propaganda to me, that whole video. And it's quite hard to see what his sources were for deciding that sustainability was 1 ton of CO2 per capita. But that is something I'd have to look into another time. And with Prince Charles, basically, I don't really see what the main problem with it was, other than he turned up to COP26. But I mean, of course he did. But what he said seemed to be a lot more sensible than what either of the other two were saying when it came to solutions, so what do you want from me? So there you go. What the Brits said at COP26 didn't seem like the worst thing in the world. It was nowhere near the level of Extinction Rebellion, and at least Boris Johnson didn't try and bring the target date back any further than 2030. Though at first it was 2050 for pretty much all of them, at least he's not going fully mental, and he's not going any further than he already has done. Things could always be worse, but hell, they could be a hell of a lot better too. But that's everything I had for you today, so as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.